Hola clase, hoy vamos a aprender cómo usar y conjugar los verbos irregulares en el pretérito o el pasado. Hello class, today we are going to learn how to conjugate irregular verbs in the preterite. The preterite tense has many irregular verbs, so it is really important that you take lots of notes. Please be sure to pause the video and take notes accordingly. So let's begin. There are 6 categories of irregular verbs in the preterite form. Now let's look at those categories. The categories are spelling and accent changers, verbs that change from E to I, verbs that change from O to U, verbs that contain UCR at the end of the verb, stem changers, and miscellaneous. Let's look at the first category, spelling and accent changers. There are 5 categories for the spelling and accent changers. Those categories are car, gar, zar verbs, verbs that change from I to Y, and the verb ver, which means to see. The first category of the spelling changes we're going to look at are car, gar, and zar verbs. For the car, gar, and zar verbs, the only part that is irregular is the one in the first person form, the yo form of the verb. As you can see, buscar in the yo form becomes busqué. The rest of the verb forms stay the same as you would conjugate them in the preterite form. But for the yo form, it would change to QUE. For the gar verbs, it would change to GUE. And for the zar verbs, it would change to CE. The reason we changed the C to a QU with the car verbs is to retain that K sound in pronunciation, the K. If we were to spell it with a C, we would have to pronounce it with an S. Busé. It does not sound right. This is the reason why we change it to a QU, because then we retain that K sound, which will be busqué. The reason we add a U after the G with the gar verbs is to retain the G sound in pronunciation, as in the English word go. If it were spelled without the U, we would have to pronounce the G as an English H sound, which would be jugué. It does not sound correctly in Spanish. It would be jugué. The reason we changed the Z to a C with the zar verbs is to retain the S sound in pronunciation. If we were to spell with a Z, we would have to pronounce it with a vibrating Z, as in the English word zu, empecé. In Spanish, that does not sound correctly pronouncing it. The correct way to say it would be empecé. Now let's look at the next category for spelling changes, which is the preterite I to Y. Whenever we have a preterite ER or IR verb that has a vowel before the ending, you must change the I in the ending to a Y in the third person forms. Él, ella, usted, third person. Ellos y ustedes, third person. Notice the Y change. The I changed into a Y. The reason the I changes into a Y is to avoid having 3 vowels in one word together. 3 vowels together in one word. Many of the I to Y preterite verbs also have accent marks which are not in regular preterite verbs. They will have this additional accent mark if the letter before the I is either an A, E, or O. This has to do with how vowel combinations affect pronunciation. So if you notice, caí, caíste, cayó, caímos, cayeron. Let's look at the word caerse, for example. If we were to conjugate these verbs in the preterite tense without the accent mark, it would be pronounced me caí, me caíste, me callo, nos caímos, se cayeron. If we were to pronounce it with the accent mark in the preterite forms, me caí, te caíste, se cayó, nos caímos, se cayeron. The verb se cayó, which means he fell, right? In the preterite tense form with an accent mark, it would say he fell. If you were to say it without the accent mark, se cayó, you're saying the person shut up, like he stopped talking. So this is why it is very important to use an accent mark, because it can change the sentence significantly. Now let's look at the last category for spelling changes, which is the verb ver, which is to see. The regular preterite verbs have accent marks in the first and third person form. But for the verb ver, we do not have any accent marks on the first and third person form, simply because these are one-syllable words. This concludes the spelling changers category. Now let's look at the E to I verbs category. Preterite E to I verbs change the E in the second to last syllable to an I, but only in the él and ellos forms. Él, ellos. Él, ellos. Él, ellos. With the preterite E to I verbs that have more than two E's, change the second E, but only in the él and ellos form. Now let's look at the O to U verbs. With the preterite O to U verbs, change the O to a U, but only in the él and ellos form. As you can see, dormir, yo dormí, tú dormiste, él, ella, usted durmió, nosotros dormimos, ellos y ustedes durmieron. There aren't many O to U verbs. These are the two most common ones, and you will see them a lot. Now let's look at verbs with UCIR endings. Verbs with UCIR endings such as conducir, introducir, and producir change the C to a J, and the endings are different than regular preterite endings. Conducir, the C changed into a J, and then we add the E. Notice that there isn't any accent mark here. What we say is yo conduje, tú condujiste, él, ella y usted condujo, nosotros condujimos, ellos y ustedes condujeron. Two things you might want to take note of is that for the UCIR verbs, there are no accent marks in the yo and él, ella, usted form. The second thing you might want to note from this verb is that the ellos form is spelled with Jeron instead of the regular preterite form Ieron. Now let's look at the stem changers categories. The stem changers categories have many stem changers. The best way to know these is simply to memorize them. I am not going to go over them with you. I will I will post them on your Google Classroom, the list of them, and you can memorize them on your own. The last category we're going to look at is the miscellaneous irregular preterite verbs. Miscellaneous preterites are dar, ir, and ser. Dar is to give, ir is to go, and ser is to be. Let's start with the verb dar. The verb dar is an AR verb that takes the form of an ER, IR verb in the preterite tense. If you look, the AR verb changes into yo di, tú diste, él dio, nosotros dimos, ellos dieron. What's also interesting is that they do not have accent marks in the third and first person form. Now let's look at the verbs ser and ir. These two verbs are the only two verbs that are exactly the same in the preterite form. When you conjugate them, they are both in the preterite form. They are both the same spelling. So if they're both spelled the same in the preterite form but mean two different things, how do we tell them apart? To be said to be in Spanish, yo fui doctor por 40 años. I was a doctor for 40 years. Tú fuiste dentista, ¿verdad? You were a dentist, right? These are the few examples of the verb ser, which means to be. Now let's look at a few examples of the verb ir, which means to go. Yo fui al doctor. I went to the doctor. Tú fuiste al dentista, ¿verdad? You went to the dentist, right? The context clue to tell these two apart is the word al, A-L, al, which is used with the word ir, to go. So whenever you see the word al, when using the preterite tense, you know that they're talking about the word ir, which means to go. Okay, guys, so this is the conjugations for the miscellaneous verbs in the preterite tense form, dar, ser, and ir. Okay, so this will conclude our irregular preterite tense introduction. Please don't forget to look at the stem changers that I will be posting in your Google Classroom. Thank you.